Center, where I am co-director of practice and education. My pronouns are she, her, and I am just so pleased to be able to introduce our presenters for this evening. Let's see, Thenmozhi Soundararajan is a Dalit American artist, community organizer, technologist, and theorist. Currently, Thenmozhi is the executive director of the Equality Labs, which she co-founded. Equality Labs is the largest Dalit civil rights organization working to empower caste-oppressed people in the United States and globally. Through her work at Equality Labs, Thenmozhi has mobilized South Asian Americans toward dismantling eons-long systems of oppression with the goal of ending caste apartheid, gender-based violence, white supremacy, and religious intolerance. Thenmozhi previously co-founded Third World Majority, an international media training organization and collective that supported people from disenfranchised groups in telling their own stories in their own way. And I'd also like to introduce Jay Kasturi from Chicago, who is a design researcher and security expert working with individuals and communities around the US who wish to define safety on their own terms. Their background is an Indian immigrant from a Brahminical South Indian family and Buddhist practitioner for the last decade. They have mobilized with their communities and co-led actions in the Chicagoland area and in Central Texas around caste abolition, reproductive justice, and domestic violence. So the last thing I would like to do is a couple of acknowledgements. We are part of a settler colonial culture in this country, and the Chicago Shambhala Center sits on unceded territory of Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Miami tribes. In addition, I'd like to do a race equity acknowledgement, recognizing the history of enslavement of Africans in this country, and particularly in light of the recent murder of Tyree Nichols. It's so important that we recognize this characteristic, this history of our country. So Thenmozhi, did you want to do also an acknowledgement?
Absolutely. And
I'm turning it over to you. Yeah. And
oh, thank you
Jay.
so much. Good evening, and Jay Beam and Jay Savitri, everyone. It's really an honor to be here, and I extend loving kindness to all of us as we enter this conversation. And one thing that we wanted to show an example of is that in the urgent conversation of caste, many Buddhist communities now are also adding a caste equity acknowledgement in the opening of all of their practices. And similar to how we understand these previous acknowledgements that Alice spoke of, it's a way that we understand the harm that we might inadvertently be doing. And in our journey to extend loving kindness to all beings, it is an extension of empathetic witness and then a return to invite all to join our communities of practice. So in this caste equity acknowledgement, some of what we're saying is, we can receive much benefit out of traditions that come out of dharmic lineages, whether it's yoga or Buddhist practice. And while we welcome and want to continue to receive that benefit, we also acknowledge that those lineages have much harm to millions of caste oppressed people over centuries. And so we do not separate the need for repair and acknowledgement for the millions of people that have been oppressed by caste apartheid. And we stand in solidarity in the pursuit of their freedom and want to make sure that we are always in loving kindness, connected and beloved community with our caste oppressed brothers and sisters. So hopefully that is a useful model. And with that, we'll open up into our conversation. And I pass it to Jay, my dear friend and wonderful conversation partner, about my book, The Trauma of Caste. And so really excited to dig into it. And Jay, over to you.
Thank you so much, Thenmozhi. I'm so excited to be here tonight and truly grateful to be able to have this conversation with you and with this amazing community of practitioners who've been so dedicated and such a consistent and vital part of the Chicagoland area. And tonight we will be mostly in a conversation, talking about your book, The Trauma of Caste, and we are inviting attendees who wish to ask questions to put their questions in the chat. And we will, at the end of the session, go through, pick them out and, pull them forward for further exploration. So again, we just request that folks, stay on mute if at all possible and put their comments and questions in the chat for tonight. Thenmozhi, I'm just so excited to be able to hear you in your own words to talk about this incredible new work that you've given the world and the tradition that you have, you're standing in. So, to really just to start with, could you talk to us a little bit about what made you write this book at this time?
Sure. Well, I think that, like many of us, I think that the pandemic really was a moment that required a pause. I think that what we are seeing, especially in the last couple of years, feels like the end of all things. And for South Asian communities, certainly, we actually, even before the pandemic started, 2019 was a very catastrophic year because a very terrible genocidal project opened in our homelands of India. And that has created tensions and driven families apart as we watch millions on the chopping block for the Hindu nationalist government in India. So we already kind of, ended 2019 on this terrifying note. And by March 20, we saw the pandemic. So we went from genocide to pandemic to an uprising to a coup, right? And in those moments, I think that, especially since I've been an organizer for many years, I felt that we needed another way forward because we've been seeing polarization, entrenchment, and deep attachment to very violent thinking. And we're not able to cross these very intense divides. And through my experience as a caste oppressed person, I wanted to think deeply, was there another way forward? A path for healing that could allow us to find opening with each other. And the other kind of big, difficult thing that kind of happened for me in that year was that my mom was diagnosed terminal and she got her kidneys failed. And if anybody knows a little bit of Chinese medicine, the kidneys are the organ of anger. And I remember that first time I went into a dialysis center, and it was one of the most heartbreaking things you'll ever see because it's all Black and brown bodies. These are the folks that are the foundations of our communities. They are bus drivers, social workers, nurses. And, after they've given their lives in service for everyone else, they're just abandoned in these centers. And the things that contribute to kidney disease are high blood pressure, are, diabetes, all these stress related conditions. And I really feel like you were seeing people die from gendered and racial and caste stress, abandoned by society that had used them to push forward its, decisions on profit. And so as I watched my mom fight for life, I wanted to find ways that we could choose life differently, because it is a time of great despair. But I knew that our ancestors would not leave us bereft, without tools to find a path forward. And so I just sat, and that's the funny thing about meditation and Buddhist practice, is that there is actually as much activity when you rest and go inward to provoke and understand your context as there is in direct action in the work. And it's not an either or. Thich Nhat Hanh has really showed us the power of socially engaged Buddhism, and the art of being mindful in determined action around our conditions of injustice. But caste oppressed people were some of the first socially engaged Buddhists. So my sitting was about, how could I speak about the experience of caste in a way that would illuminate a path forward, not just for caste oppressed people, but for all of us. And that's why I wrote this book.
I think I mean, one of the things that I keep coming back to is how necessary this book is in this moment, for all the reasons that you mentioned, because of the chaos and the violence that is being experienced across the South Asian world, both in South Asia and even here in the diaspora. And I'm also just the lack of possibly like broader awareness in the communities in which we exist about what is actually happening. And so I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about for our audience that is unfamiliar with caste. Could you give us a working definition, for the purposes of this conversation?
Sure. So caste is a system of exclusion analogous to race. And it has its origins, in 2000 BC in Hindu scriptures. And the idea is similar to race. It's based on a social fiction. It set up a group of people at the top. And in this case, it was Brahmin priests who created the scriptures that said, people at the top of this pyramid are more spiritually pure and have the best jobs and have the most access and control in society. And then they started to grade other communities in differing levels of purity and access to power. So underneath the Brahmin priests, you have the warriors who are called the Kshatriyas. You have the merchants who are called the Vaishyas. You have the Shudras who are the peasants. And then outside of that whole caste pyramid were people who were seen as spiritual criminals. People were seen as so spiritually defiling to other people that they were deemed untouchable, because to touch them would be to be defiled. And so because of their crimes in past lives, they deserved to be shunned, excluded, given the worst backbreaking labor. And you could not organize around your conditions because it was your duty, your dharma, to fulfill that because you were a spiritual criminal. And so it's the worst kind of oppression because it is a religious abuse. And that's the community that my family comes from. And, we eschew the term untouchable because it's a slur. No one gets to determine our position towards God. And we use instead the term Dalit or caste oppressed, or people might identify as another religious community, because this is not an acceptable social system to live under. And then outside of that, there are also indigenous people from South Asia who call themselves Adivasi, or tribal peoples. So this caste system is so virulent, and it's one of the oldest systems of domination in the world, and it is active today. It is active in South Asia and impacts 1 in 4 people in the world, over 1.9 billion people. And in the United States, it's very active, where we see here that South Asian immigrants have also brought it here, and its impacts are debilitating. 1 in 4 South Asians, who are caste oppressed, experience some form of physical and verbal assault. 1 in 3 educational discrimination, and 2 out of 3 workplace discrimination. So this is one of the reasons why it's become this moment of reckoning in dharmic practice, because as Buddhists, as people who are from yoga communities, we draw upon texts, we draw upon this context, and there are hundreds of millions of people who have been harmed. And so as part of our fight for freedom, we are asking all communities interested in justice and freedom and loving kindness for all beings to stand with us and to hear our stories and to be part of our movement for caste abolition and freedom.
I wanted to see if you could say more too about the lens that you're bringing to this book, and specifically to, your Buddhist perspective as a Dalit Buddhist. You talk about caste specifically in this book, which I found so powerful, through the lens of healing. And I wanted to see if you could say more about that for our audience. I would like to go into it more later, but to set the groundwork, could you say more about what brought you to talk about caste in this particular perspective first?
Sure. And so I'm going to talk about this also from my own Buddhist practice, because we're all
Yes.
Buddhists here, is that, I am a Buddhist the way that Tina Turner is a Buddhist, or Alice
I
Walker
want to
is
hear
a
more
Buddhist.
about this. I got to hear more about this.
Well,
Yeah.
when I was younger, I don't know if you guys ever saw that movie about her life, What's Love
Yeah.
Got to Do with It?
Yeah.
There's this really incredibly visceral scene after she's been, beaten, to a pulp by her partner, Ike Turner, and she flees, right? She flees, she's got nothing, she's got like not even shoes, she's beat up, she doesn't have any money, and she has to do this humiliating thing to ask for a hotel room. And then one of the next scenes, she's with her girlfriend, and she is, and her girlfriend is a Nichiren Buddhist, and they have this moment of peace and surrender with each other, where she starts to chant Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, right?
Right.
And there was something that scene rang a bell in my spirit, because as a survivor of religious abuse, I felt for a very long time there was no place I was ever going to have a spiritual home.
Yeah.
As a child, it felt so wounding to be told that I was spiritually defiling. And I remember when I first, learned I was Dalit and my mom had the talk with me, one of the things that was like racing through my mind was like, what crime did I do? Was I a rapist? Was I a murderer? Was I a thief? Would that stuff follow me if I was here in the United States? And I think people really misunderstand how spiritual children are, because I was only like 10 or 11, and I would talk to God all the time. And after that moment, there was a rip where I felt like I was not worthy to talk to God. And so I think it really provoked not only a journey towards justice as an organizer, but it also provoked that feeling of wanting to be a spiritual seeker, because I wanted a spiritual home. All of us does, right? All of us do. So that path of Buddhism being a refuge was really true for me, because while I searched many different traditions, the home of what it was to be able to find ways to integrate the mind and body and spirit, particularly in secular ways. And also that, and this is a very painful truth of the moment that we're in right now, part of why that scene with Tina Turner really rang so true to me is that we are in a moment where we are all exposed to deep violence. And we are not in situations where we can remove ourselves from violence. What we can do is attenuate the signal of violence. And that's what Buddhist practice really taught me, was that, I know as a caste-oppressed person, I face, constant gaslighting, violence, and harm just for speaking my truth and fighting for the right to be free. There isn't a day that I don't get some disgusting piece of dehumanizing information. And those attacks can be so corrosive in the body and the mind and spirit. And I think my work around really thinking about caste through the lens of trauma, thinking about it through the lens of embodiment, was one, to first create a really honest conversation about what's happening when we are dehumanizing people through a system that's socio-economic and religious in nature, the way that caste is. but also to give permission to those of us who come from casted lineages to be embodied, both be embodied in terms of our pain, but also in our ask for healing. And, this may be something that you guys are experiencing even in this conversation. Oftentimes, when we talk about deep injustice, we start to disassociate. We can get very linear, very specific in our minds, but our bodies are in a totally different place. And that was really true for me, even with this book. Like, I am an expert of many years on the issue of caste, but I can say very truthfully that when I started this book, I was not dialed into how much pain and anguish was in my body. Whether it was listening to certain scriptures that would make my stomach, churn, or the rapidness of my heart when someone calls me a terrorist, or tries to demean myself or my colleagues at Equality Labs, or the fear that had to happen when I had to move into a safe house because bigots were so unable to hear a Dalit person talk that they would rather, try to send me death threats than allow me to speak about caste equity. To speak about the body is actually to ground us in the material conditions of suffering that are occurring around deep systems of exclusion. And when we don't center the body, we're actually only having a third of the conversation. And so this is why I wanted to do that.
Yeah. And to pick apart that thought more, because I think for the context of this conversation where we are, talking into a Buddhist community, one of the things that I kept coming back to in your book was the way that the book itself, is a representation of this, but there's this long and this deep refrain, since the very beginning, in Buddhism, illustrated by the Buddha's life, and even in his earliest followers. There's this refrain between that and Dalit life and struggle, and you're drawing upon that for the structure and the grounding of your book, and the experience. And it's, for me, the experience of that was such a clear and such a powerful coming home. And I can't really, there's no words to describe the experience of having something that I think we all, growing up as South Asian, grow up with the sense of something deeply wrong with our families and our communities, and not being able to give words to it effectively. And then to be able to find your book, to pull all of this together in a way that felt truly authentic and grounded, was an incredible experience. And it's also something that is not deeply acknowledged, right, in Western Buddhist spaces, the experience of caste in Buddhist texts and Buddhist literature. And people are practicing all the time with texts that actually mention caste throughout it. And it's this dissonance. And I was hoping, you could say a little bit more about, as a Dalit Buddhist yourself, how you see this resonance between, Buddhist practice and Dalit life and struggle, and maybe how you see those current manifestations of socially engaged Buddhism, showing up for folks and for leadership.
Sure. So I think one thing that is really powerful for people to know is that, when you learn about how violent the caste system is, because it is a terrible system, and my book really goes into the data of the present, as well as gives a really rich history of caste as it's found across all religions. One thing that is very true is that the history of South Asia is really the history of revolution and counter-revolution, which is what one of our famous caste-oppressed leaders, Dr. Ambedkar, always used to say. And that's because, from the first moment that a caste-oppressed person was enslaved under the caste system, there was resistance. And you know, a lot of the things that I think is important as we start to really get into, you know, the ideas behind the caste system, is we have to really know what is that ideology that kicked it off. So in the terms of when we're talking about anti-Blackness, we always use that term white supremacy, right?
Right.
So in the
Exactly.
term, you know, in the context of caste apartheid, the animating ideology that gave the justification for the division of people and labor in these inhumane ways, it's called Brahmanism, named after the caste that developed those scriptures. So we use Brahmanism very similar to white supremacy. And so in our context, when we start to really take apart the way Brahmanism has corroded so many institutions and dharmic lineages and in South Asian culture, we call that de-Brahmanizing. And de-Brahmanizing is the first step in decolonizing any practices that come from our context. So that becomes really important when you think about the origin story of Buddhism. Because, you know, a lot of times, especially the way that you learn Buddhism in the West, you know, people think that, you know, Buddha's kind of resistance to suffering was like an existential thing, you know, but in fact, there were material conditions that he
Exactly.
was literally protesting around, and that was of Brahmanism. It's one of the reasons why they call Buddhism one of the, you know, one of the traditions that were the first resistant points to Brahmanism, and they call them Shramanic faiths. And these Shramanic faiths, whether it was Buddhism or Jainism, what was significant about them was that they were trying to equalize access to the divine. Because where in the context of these Hindu scriptures, you have Brahmins that are the conduit to God, Buddha was saying everyone has access. You just have to sit. You just have to integrate. And let's be in communities of practice. And and many of the debates of those early Buddhists was about what does this look like? And not everybody was in agreement with it. But it is important to know that Dalits were at the core of this conversation and were the first socially engaged Buddhists. And so I think that that history is not very well known to American Sanghas. And so I always remember, for example, one of my first experiences when I was like so excited to be a Buddhist. I had a professor that was a religious studies teacher, and he
Right.
was doing the unit on Buddhism. And I really wanted to come out to him, both as a Dalit and as a Buddhist. And he was this, you know, white professor. And I came up to him and I was like, you know, I'm so, you know, I'm also a Buddhist. And then I said, I'm a Dalit Buddhist and I come from this tradition. And he said, oh, you're one of those fake Buddhists.
That's wild to me.
And, you know, the minute he said that, my heart broke into a million pieces because, you know, again, I'm a survivor of religious abuse and I wanted community. I wanted Sangha so bad. And when he said that, you know, I thought in my head, well, yeah, maybe I am a fake Buddhist. And so I kind of put that dream of being part of a Sangha away and I didn't think about it for many years. And only as I became, you know, a caste abolitionist and did all of the scholarly work and met and, you know, interacted with Dalit Buddhists in India, I realized what a load of white supremacist bullshit. And his ignorance in that statement came from the confidence of white supremacy and his lack of understanding of the foundational truths of Buddhist practice. So to me, being here as a Dalit Buddhist and a Dalit feminist Buddhist is so powerful because I feel like I'm able to finally be embodied in the faith and the community of practice that I want to be, and also have this really wonderful invitation to all of the American Buddhists that, you know, there is actually this urgent root at the beginning of all Buddhist practice that we can learn so much from. And it also teaches us so much about different ways that we manage spiritual practice. Because, and Jay, you and I talked about this before this talk. I think that one of the challenges with dharmic lineages, especially as they're practiced in the US, is that there's been like a first phase of resistance to the white supremacy and orientalization of Buddhist practice here. But I think that it's also created conditions where there's a lot of abuse. And people feel like if you're in a dharmic tradition, you have to surrender to your teacher, you have to surrender to the culture, and you leave your critical thinking, your moral values, your understanding of the worldview, because if you don't, you lose your ability to integrate and, you know, access nirvana. And what I want to say to people is that surrender on the mat is not the same thing as surrender of consent and the surrender of choice and the surrender of your moral compass. And that's a very difficult and opening conversation, I think, that helps us create cultures of affirmative consent in all of our sanghas, because this is the learning that caste-oppressed survivors of religious abuse can really offer to the American Sangha communities. You know, what has been told in very dogmatic and hierarchical ways has a root actually in a system of exclusion called caste. So for us to be nimble and non-attached allows us to be far more inclusive and co-create new ways of being with each other in loving kindness.
The analogy that occurred to me in the space between our last talk about this was that I think there's sometimes this experience of in Western Buddhist spaces of almost like a deconstructive experience of Buddhism, right? Like this existential deconstructive practice, and which is great because it's sort of like, if you think about it, like deconstructive cooking or something, you get to play around with like these core ingredients and do this amazing like gastronomy around like all of these different like tastes and flavors and explore deeply. But at the same time, it may not be something that you can actively share with other people or build a sangha around. And it's this sense of how can we actually pull our experiences, pull our practice together and come back to ourselves and each other in a holistic way. And that is something that, as socially engaged Buddhism, hopefully that's something that we are learning to cultivate, in sanghas across the US. But specifically to leadership today, as Buddhists sort of looking forward to learning more about other communities and really bringing their practice into the world more. Is there anything that you would want them to learn, I guess, lean more into when it comes to their understanding of caste?
Well, I think that, all of these different communities within American Sanghas that come from backgrounds that have been excluded, whether it's Indigenous practitioners of Buddhism or people who are Black Buddhists or Dalit Buddhists, I think what we're really seeing is a way of practice that's really helping people think about how do we manage and understand and bring mindfulness to some of the thorniest issues that are polarizing and creating suffering amongst us. And certainly for me, when I began this book, part of one of my questions was really thinking about what is going on in the bodies of the privileged. Because, just like we're in this really horrific moment where we are seeing, white folks around the country, ban Black thinkers and Black curriculum. You have white parents in Tennessee that are trying to pass laws saying the teaching of slavery traumatizes white children. The usage of trauma is being used to weaponize, actions against the teaching of history, and which is the foundation for creating empathetic witness. And in my own context around caste, I have seen such absurd situations of advocacy. And I think, Jay, you and I talked about it, where I always remember this one woman who gave a testimony when we were speaking around, passing caste equity. And you would just look at her and her eyes were not present. You could just imagine, because we kind of like heard her over the audio, but it was just an absurd conversation because she was saying like, are you ready to have, Santa Clara County be ground zero for Hindu genocide? Do you want us to wear our caste like the Star of David on our shoulder? Are you ready to have the blood of Hindus on your hand, Santa Clara? And, you just have to take a pause. Like, this woman was yelling at the top of her lungs. It didn't make sense. But also, what was being decided? We were just talking about adding caste as a protected category.
Right.
That does not hurt anybody. It only would target people who are being bigoted. But, for her, in the body of a privileged person, she felt sure her nervous system went to a state of survival level anxiety simply because a Dalit community was asking for, some sort of alleviation of the extreme discrimination that we face. And that's the polarization that I think there's a lot that we can examine and use the tools of mindfulness that come out of Buddhist practice. And for me, I was very influenced by Indigenous thinkers like Eduardo Duran, who talked about the soul wound, which is a wound that, exists not just from our pain in our own lifetimes, but a pain linked to our lineages. So for Indigenous people, it might be that of settler colonialism. For Black folks, it might be that of enslavement. And Resmaa Menakem took that idea even further and talked about how, the privileged and the oppressed are linked in this very painful way with soul wounds. And so both communities need to work on the training of their nervous system. And that's where I really started to try to adapt the work of thinkers like Ruth King, who's really done amazing work about race and mindfulness, to how we might practice that with the context of caste. And Jay, you know this because you were part of our Unlearning Caste Supremacy workshop. We have now trained thousands of activists using these Buddhist techniques, introducing the facts and painful histories, but also preparing and supporting people for courageous conversation and confrontation of their own nervous systems by using Buddhist mindfulness practice. So I view that as one of the ways that we can think about socially engaged Buddhism in the world, because I'm always thinking about like what Thich Nhat Hanh wrote about, that they had a choice to meditate inside the monastery walls during the war, or they could go out with the bombs and support the people. And of course, they chose to be out there with the people. And so this is a time where we need to use Buddhism not just to center our nervous systems from the constant onslaughts we have, but to also help us build resilience for courageous conversation and confrontation so that we can be the thunderbolt in those that we see that are being held hostage to their trauma, and work with them to de-escalate them and bring them back into the family of humanity. And that's a tremendous thing, especially for privileged bodies, because again, to other another is to dehumanize yourself. And so I think many of these privileged bodies, whether they're caste bodies or racial bodies or cis bodies, it is very discomforting to be confronted with your privilege. But discomfort is not the same as discrimination. And that's why we need to hold the door open to bring them back and to hold them accountable so that the burden isn't falling on the excluded.
That makes me think a little bit more about something that you mentioned earlier too, because this position that you're holding, in this particular moment and in this space is as a survivor of also religious abuse. And that is so resonant because I think we're all aware of this, but especially in the last few years, so many Western Buddhist spaces, but broadly, Buddhist spaces in general, there's this growing awareness, visibility, and conversation around religious abuse. And, for example, Shambhala Sangha, like so many other Sanghas, has had to face real challenges around these revelations of religious sexual abuse. And I think I'd love to hear what you can share from your own experience and from this book as well, to other survivors of religious abuse who are navigating, their experience of, privileged and oppressed bodies of their own and of each other, and as navigating these spaces in which there has been so much harm.
Well, I would just invite us to take a little breath there, because I think whenever we talk about abuse, there's parts of your bodies that are going to clench, so I'm going to take a breath. Feel free to take one with me. And I want to just really extend loving kindness to all of those people that have been part of that very challenging truth telling. And I guess part of the lessons of caste and how we can really think about the return of consent in all domains, because that's also part of the process of de-Brahmanizing, is for us to be nimble when it comes to our traditions. And what I mean by that is that oftentimes people feel terrified to challenge the power in religious institutions because they're worried, if I challenge this, I lose access to the divine. And as someone who was shunned from the divine at birth, I can tell you, no one is the gatekeeper for your path towards integration. And, that thing about the surrender of consent that I spoke about earlier, that is so crucial for many communities that are trying to repair after mass harm, whether it's from a teacher or a particular, practice in a lineage. There's always openings and adaptions that can happen. But, before there can be repair, there must be acknowledgement. And there must be some sort of amends to those that have been harmed. And oftentimes we do them out of sequence, right? Because people want to rush to put it behind them, because that's what we do with trauma. Something really big happens that breaks our consciousness. It is too big for one individual to hold in the container of their consciousness. And so it splits us apart. We just want to forget about it and we go away, right? And it may even evoke a fight, freeze, or flee, response in our nervous system. But part of the mindfulness practices that we're learning in Buddhism is for us to slow down in the face of that pain, to witness it, because when we don't witness it, it stays unresolved in our body. And that's what we're trying to break through the witnessing of what's happening. And so it is important that we talk about it, whether it's, child abuse in the Roman Catholic Church, or, teachers that are abusing their disciples and dharmic lineages. It's okay to talk about it. It's also okay to have grief about it. And it's also okay to separate the value and benefit you get out of your own practice and the accountability work that needs to happen in your communities of practice. In some ways, you have to kind of put them on parallel tracks, and work with beloved and trusted communities to create transformative justice circles for accountability. But even to move to something like transformative justice, you need to have self-reflective mindfulness control of your nervous system. And most of us do not, have that. Like we're all works in progress around how
Yeah.
we're starting to be more in touch with our nervous system. So it is a learning process. And that's the thing. We're co-evolving, co-learning together, and we're making tons of mistakes. And as long as we're compassionate with each other about it, we'll be okay.
I find that so deeply affirming, and so it makes me remember my resilience to hear that, and makes me want to just be acknowledged and be grateful to all of the people that I know are out here doing that work. Sometimes I know feels like we're out here sitting and practicing on our own, and even sometimes with the Sangha, it feels like you can be in a room totally alone with a dozen other people as we're all sitting and practicing together, and then have that switch turn on and us start to feel like we're breathing again together. And just hearing you remind us about our nervous systems and co-regulating together is just such a beautiful reminder, and I really appreciate that. I don't want to close this conversation because I have so many other things I want to just pick your brain about, but I know we're coming to the end of our time here. But I do want to ask one last question before we, dig into some of the questions here in the chat. But what are, some actions that we can take to be a part of caste abolition, in addition to reading this book? And, what would you leave with, with folks here in the audience who are new to this conversation?
Well, one thing is I would encourage you all to buy the book and read it in community with each other, because this book is really meant to be read in beloved community, because there's exercises, there's worksheets, there's meditations, and I think that part of the shunning that is at the core of caste is healed when you build community. So I would just encourage that first and foremost. But I think as a Sangha, there are many steps that you can make as, a group of practitioners. The first is if you have a list of where you have all of your non-discrimination protected, categories as part of your non-discrimination policy, add caste. So if you say that you're a Sangha that, invites all communities and does not tolerate discrimination based on race, or gender, or class, and sexual orientation, add caste. And that right away signals to anyone who is caste oppressed that this is a safe place. Welcome to all practitioners. It's a super easy ad, but when you do that, it really is quite profound. And it's also an acknowledgement that you come from a dharmic lineage that may feel exclusive to caste oppressed people, like some of the stories that I shared. The other thing I would really ask for folks is in the beginning of classes or programs to do a little small caste equity acknowledgement that builds off that non-discrimination policy and also kind of, anchors people to where did this lineage come from? And, when the Buddha is talking about suffering, what is a suffering that initiated this tradition and that there are people resisting this tradition even now? That to me is a very powerful ask I would recommend. And then thirdly, I would love for folks to, sign up for our organization, Equality Labs, which is a Dalit civil rights organization. And we are spearheading many campaigns related to caste abolition around the country, in particular, fighting for equal access to all workplaces because of the significant discrimination we're seeing in American institutions. So if you could take a moment and go to our website at equalitylabs.org, sign up for our newsletter, follow us on our socials. That's one way to make sure that you're involved and part of the caste abolition movement.
Thank you so much again for your time, for taking this much energy to speak to us and share of your experience and of your book and this massive effort that you've gifted the world. And I'm so grateful to be able to be here and just listen to you and share you with the world. Thank you so much, Thenmozhi. And there were a couple of questions here in the chat, and I did want to lift one up. Jean Marie, who is a absolute gem, a wonderful friend here in the Chicago Sangha, shared a comment here that I'd like to lift up. Jean Marie says, my Black parents gave us the talk, and I'd like to know what Dalit parents include in the talk with their children.
That is such a great question. And, I have to say, I didn't even know that the terminology of the talk could be used until I heard my other, Black brothers and sisters speak about it. And I was like, oh yeah, we have one of those too. So for me, it happened after I did a report about the Bhopal tragedy, which was it's one of the largest industrial disasters in world history. And the majority of the victims of that were untouchable people. They were Dalits. And I remember as a child reading the term untouchable, and I was like, oh my God, what is this? This is the most terrible word on the planet. And I went to an encyclopedia because the internet wasn't then, and I looked it up and I read about it, and I read about the caste system and how it was connected to reincarnation. And the more that I read, the more horrified I got. And so then I ran to my mom and I was like, Mom, I just learned about this. There's these people that are untouchable, and oh my God, like this is terrible. Like, what caste are we? And I always remember her face. She just kind of looked really overwhelmed and she looked away. And I felt like when she looked away, there was a moment where I felt her kind of gathering courage, gathering strength, because this was something she had left her country because she didn't want to be in this system. And here was this daughter that she loved more than anything in the world, asking her an impossible question, because how do you explain a system that is going to dehumanize them, and that can invite violence to someone that you think you care and love so much, you have so much care and love for, right? So, she just took a little moment and then she brought me close, and it was like a really tender moment. And she said, caste is a lie that the wicked tell, you know, and, it doesn't exist and it doesn't matter anything that they say, but we are part of those communities that are untouchable, but don't listen to it. We're here now, we're safe, and just know how much I love you. And I think that was probably all that she could say at that moment, because she was really overwhelmed, and I was really overwhelmed because I was a little kid, and I really thought we were part of the upper caste. I was like, so I was imagining that whole other story. I did not, expect that twist that we were untouchable. And then that really haunted me for weeks. Like, I would stay up late at night and just wonder, what did I do? What did I do? And the more that I'd ask that question, the more that I would look at, well, what's going on with my family? And what I saw was that even though my parents had left India to escape caste, they were still living as people traumatized by caste. They had nightmares and they were living in the closet. In fact, my mother used to pray in the closet because she was Christian and my dad was Hindu, and they were both raised Hindu and Christian, but they kind of but they both settled on their individual faiths. And my mom was so afraid of people finding out that she was Christian that she kind of worshiped Jesus in a closet. So we had a little altar for Christ in our playroom that was hidden in the closet. It had like a little image of Jesus and Mary. She had her Thummel prayer books and candles. And before we could even open it, it was in our playroom, so all the blinds had to be closed. And she would like kind of look around, and then she'd bring us over. We had to be very quiet. We'd open the closet, and then we'd pray, and when it was over, she would then slowly turn off the candles, close the closet, open the blinds. And this went on like my whole childhood. And I thought it was the strangest thing, because we live in the United States, right? This is a Christian country. But my mom was terrified that other Indians would find out that we were Christian because of how much, bigotry we would face. So it was awful, and so there was lots of little incidents like that. But the talk was the opening of my parents trying to really address, what was going on for us. And, I think the thing about children is that in the face of historical trauma, even if you don't talk about it as a parent, we're astute to what's going on. We're like, detectives, we're just like, what's going on? Why are our parents doing that? I need to know what's going on, And so I was the queen of like uncomfortable questions for years, until I finally found people that would answer my questions. And that was the opening of caste. And in another way, that's also part of being a seeker and being a Buddhist. Like, the inquiry of pain and suffering was the impetus for me trying to kind of understand the terrains of what had oppressed my people. And I see a question in the chat about consent. The piece of Brahmanism that I think is so important for people to know is that nobody consented to the caste system. It's not like we said, oh yeah, I agree, I deserve to be a slave and I shouldn't have any rights. Brahmanism works through dogmatism and by removing consent in all domains. So you can't question that you're a slave, you can't question your conditions, you can't question what's happened to your body. And certainly as a cis woman or a queer person or a non-binary person, you don't even control your reproductive function. So there's so much judgment, and and you're just supposed to take it. So
Right.
when we're talking about de-Brahmanizing, which is the first step of decolonizing all of our dharmic lineages, we have to think about the ways that we have removed consent from each other and rebuild affirmative consent in all domains. So first, it might be in terms of interpersonal relationships. It might be in terms of the ways that a Sangha builds agreements around its code of conducts, in terms of, who can be spiritual authorities. and also reckoning with past historical trauma. So, I think that consent is a key that unlocks much of the pain that surrounds our practices, from historical violence, whether it's settler colonialism, the enslavement of Africans, or our experience as caste-oppressed people. These are not ancillary questions to our practice of liberation. They are central and core. And that is really the distinct offering that's happening at this moment in this reckoning within Buddhist communities. This is not a refuge from politics. The politics of this kind of freeing conversation is the core of our practice. And that really transforms everything about how we are in right relationship with each other, and even deepens even further the meaning of metta, or loving kindness.
Thank you for lifting up that notion of consent in such a way that helps highlight its agency, and that isn't something that we lose or give up on the seat, on the cushion, or are somehow able to just write off because now we've claimed Buddhist practice for ourselves. So I really appreciate you centering agency and consent again in that way. So thank you so much, Thenmozhi. We are just at time. Just one last thing. We did have someone ask about when the next Unlearning Caste Supremacy trainings will be. I was wondering if you wanted to maybe touch on that before we close out for the evening.
Sure. We will have Unlearning Caste Supremacy workshops, most likely in the spring. And the best way to kind of find out when our workshops are going to be opening up is on our socials, which you can find us on Equality Labs on Instagram and TikTok and on Twitter. And you can also find us on our website. So just kind of follow us and sign up for our newsletter. I anticipate we should be having something, by April or May.
And there is actually one last question, if you have a second for it. And it was there. We have a couple of folks here asking if you have a personal somatic process for moving through shame as it arises in your body individually and in interpersonal exchanges, whether they're Buddhist or other practices. And that's from Anuradhika and Malika.
Oh, thank you for that, you guys. So I think shame is such a useful emotion, because it really unearths, where we have conditioning that we need to examine. And sometimes for me, I feel shame in my heart. Sometimes I feel shame in my gut. I also feel like sometimes shame makes me kind of roll my shoulders forward, or I want to kind of, move inward. And I can give you a really good example of shame. So, after there was this really terrible incident that I experienced, that I talked a little bit about, where I was deplatformed at Google by bigots, and they wrote in these terrible things about how I was, they were afraid for their lives if I spoke about caste equity. And as far as I know, nobody's ever died from, a DEI talk, right? I mean, Jay, you could tell me different, but I think that's never happened, right? But
Oh my God.
it was such an absurd situation. And not only were the conditions so chaotic, what these bigots created inside that company, it led to this amazing ally who was a senior manager resigning because she was shocked at the level of casteism she saw from Google management. And the aftermath of that was that, our organization was targeted for weeks with disinformation, and the most disgusting things were said about me. Direct violence was thrown at me. Someone tried to go after my parents and try to assault them, and I had to move into a safe house, right? So it was an extremely traumatizing experience. And I remember during this whole time period, we still had clients that we were doing caste equity trainings for. And I remember being in one of those meetings, and the person there was very brittle. They were they still were in the position where they were going to continue with the training, but they were very concerned. They were like, well, we don't want to be the other Google. And I remember I felt so ashamed, because they kept then starting to ask me questions to make sure that this wouldn't lead to the same kind of thing. And it was really putting the burden on the excluded, right? And I remember there was a moment I had to turn off the camera because I felt so ashamed, and it was like that moment, I'm sure, just like what Tina Turner experienced when she had just been beaten to a pulp and then had to go into a hotel and didn't have money to her name and had to say, yes, I need refuge. And at that time, I just wanted refuge. I felt so ashamed, at what had happened. And it was so difficult, and I remember the shame being so much because what it takes to speak truth is so hard. Truth is so difficult. It is so visceral. It is something that transforms you because it's like a holy fire. When you commit to the truth and you surrender to it, you really are surrendering so much. And I think in that process, what I do when I examine that shame, and this is me talking from someone who's talking about this from an oppressed body, but there is similar shame in a privileged body, especially if you're really witnessing in real time the ways that your networks of privilege have also been complicit with deep violence. And I remember having this conversation with someone who was dominant caste, and they were really reckoning with the fact that their family was essentially plantation owners. And this may be like a very new concept for people to consider, but we think a lot about the slave plantation system in the United States, and we're finally talking about the fact that plantations were not romantic sites, of the South. These were sites of hell in which, Black bodies were desecrated, exploited, raped, maimed, and tortured. And there's nothing romantic about that. And, in that same spirit, the Indian landscape, the South Asian landscape, and all of those rural lands there are similarly drenched in the blood of caste oppressed people. And there's a very distinct difference of being a caste that is the workers of the land versus being the plantation owners. And many castes here that have immigrated to South Asia because of, to the United States come from those plantation type owning castes. And so when this person was really reckoning with that, they felt so horrified because they finally understood the innuendos that were happening with their cousins back at home, and also why they couldn't go out at night because their cousins were doing bad things with the women in the fields, and I think that it just broke them, because again, the gender-based violence that they had seen in their family was a mirror to the gender-based violence that their family was inflicting on caste oppressed bodies. And I think the only way to really address shame is to go through it. You just have to go through it. And part of it is slowing down and just creating that container to just witness it, to breathe through it, to have someone give empathetic witness to you about it, and to know the shame does not define you. But the shame will still be a part of you until you witness it and you actively work to dismantle the structures that created the conditions for you to feel that. But we often try to kind of do it all at the same time, because again, we're letting our minds do all of the work. That we think that the mind is the most powerful thing, when it is in fact the body that is the foundation for all of our work. So, you have to do your own personal work as a body of privilege to work on your shame, to work on your complicity, to work on the ways that you've, really built a nervous system that has very little resilience when it comes to racial stress or caste stress or gendered stress, whatever system it is. And that resilience comes from doing that frank acknowledgement, and ideally with lots of different communities. Members who are also grappling with it, because again, we heal when we start to witness each other. And so breaking out of those silos, talking openly with it. And Jay, you were like one of those first people who really taught me about that, because I always remember that first Unlearning Caste Supremacy workshop where you talked about your story, and it just broke everyone open, you know, because that's the power of stories, the shortest distance between two people, and the way systems of exclusion work when they make it taboo for us to share our pain and to share the opening that our pain creates, you know. And that's why, you know, Thich Nhat Hanh talks about the fact that, you know, there's no lotus without mud, right?
Yeah.
So
Oh
our
my
suffering, the
goodness.
conditions that teach us about the ways that our base programming has limited us, we can really transmute when we start to connect with each other.
So I would just like to say thank you. Thank you so, so very much. It's been a wonderful talk, and I'm so glad to know about this. And I think we've really learned something about what we as privileged people can do. And, you know, I think the notion of being willing to feel our discomfort because of our complicity is really important. And thanks so much
Well,
to both of you, really. Thenmozhi, of course, for the book, but also Jay.
well, absolutely, Jay, because Jay has
Yeah.
been a fellow traveler in the Dhamma with me. And so it was really an honor to share a space with her and her baby that is going to be joining us
Yeah.
right now.
Yeah.
So there's actually 3 people on the stage, guys. I don't know if you
Yeah.
know this. I'm so excited about that. Actually 4. But the other thing I just wanted to say is that, you know, focusing on the wound doesn't mean that we're going to be staying in a wounded place. It actually allows the wound to be a portal to each other, because ultimately the reasons why we're doing this is to heal and to integrate. So I just want to leave people here with that invitation of healing and opening, because everywhere that there's been such dark moments in history, we've always found opening and a light. And so I just wish everyone here to carry the light of hope with each other as we end our conversation today. And it's been so healing to share beloved community with all of you. So thank you. And Jay Beam and Jay Savitri.
Jay Beam, Jay Savitri, thank you so much, Thenmozhi, for your time, and to the Chicago Shambhala community for hosting this conversation, and just giving us a chance to think out loud together and hear from Thenmozhi about her wonderful book and to share her experiences. So please go check out this book. They are on sale at the center.
Yes, we have copies.
Yeah, and there's a link to the Amazon. There's the Amazon link is there here as well in the chat. So please read it and reach out to us. I'd love to hear what other folks here in Chicago are thinking, and maybe we can do a follow-up.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sounds wonderful.
Bye, everyone. Much love.
Thank you.
Talk
Thank
to you
you
soon.
all.
Bye.